Okay, so my name is Heather Olivier, and I've had the honor of moderating today's event. So I'm grateful to be here. I'm speaking with you all. I am just recently I finished my PhD at the University of New Orleans, and this is the study that was my dissertation study. It's entitled Therapeutic Approaches to Working with Perinatal Loss Clients, a Grounded Theory Study. So the agenda, the points I'm going to be hitting today will be first, situating the study. Secondly, data collection and analysis, the research findings, the discussion of the findings, and the conclusion. And I put this at the beginning of all of my presentations as the content sensitivity. And I wanted to keep it in this one as well, even though we're hearing a lot of this, which is good. So situating the study, perinatal loss is any sort of reproductive loss, and in the literature, the existing literature, going back to the socialization and the co-construction of self, we have first that primary socialization beginning in childhood, where we learn whatever the cultural norms are that are reinforced by whatever nuclear family we're living in, whether it's biological or not biological. Then we have secondary socialization, which continues on whenever we break away from families and begin to start our own lives with adulthood, jobs, things like that. And then with that group membership, because we don't want to feel isolated, we don't want that isolation, like in one of the previous presentations, that danger of isolation that we fear, that's why we maintain that group membership. And so because of that, it's this reciprocal process that continue on and is perpetuated. And because of that, those cultural perceptions really create this context of how we perceive perinatal loss. And so it's seen in the literature and shows up in the literature as a psychological loss, a non-event, a medical event, and a reproductive process, something that should be expected, even in the previous presentation, so like it was said in there. So also in the literature, when it comes to how we experience the loss, ambiguous loss and disenfranchised grief show up hand in hand across the literature. Ambiguous loss being the physical absence, but the psychological presence of a person. And then the disenfranchised grief, that is a loss and the subsequent grief that is not recognized by society in whatever society you live in. And then Tony Walter published a book recently that about death and dying in the modern society, where he even goes a step further and says that it is a hyper-enfranchised grief, and that perinatal loss, when people experience it, is a grief so terrible that others fear to come close to those enduring it. So again, just putting it into context, they're individuals who experience perinatal loss experience the impact relationally. So they withdraw from others. They have identity confusion. Am I a parent? Am I not? What is my role in society at this point? Occupationally, I know in the US, there is currently not any type of leave for, let's say, someone who has a loss at 38 weeks and they are still having to go through the recovery process. If there's no baby to see, then they do not get parental leave. So even with that, it's minimized. Then religious and spiritually, it causes us to question higher power. And then the pathology. So in the DSM, which is used in the US for diagnostic purposes, the criteria around grief and trauma symptoms always lists outside of cultural norms, which is the basis of this study that we all subjectively have our own cultural norms and our perceptions. So situating the study again, the problem statement is, although research shows all of this evidence for unique grief reactions, there's really not a model that exists of how to work with grief and trauma concurrently when working with these clients. Because it's so dismissed, existing literature really shows that gap. So the conceptual framework I use to really place this study was combining symbolic interactionism with relational cultural theory. So symbolic interactionism being we interact based on the symbolism we place subjectively on whatever words we're using. So all of us here from different countries, we might use the same word, but we all experience it differently based on our subjective experiences. And then relational cultural theory, that we grow by being in connection with others. So because of that, the symbolism we place on things based on our cultural context really impacts how we either have connection or disconnection. So the purpose of the study was to co-construct a therapeutic model by interacting with the data that I collected, and then also with collecting that data, being able to see different perceptions and how those perceptions impact the therapeutic relationship. So I had the overarching research question I had was, how do mental health practitioners approach working with clients who have experienced perinatal loss? And then I had 4 sub-questions to really be able to dive into those different areas. So the first one, really investigating cultural perceptions that influence practitioners' work. The second being, how do practitioners approach working with grief and trauma concurrently and separately? The third being really investigating what therapeutic approaches inform their clinical methods, their treatment planning, and therapeutic interventions. And then finally, what therapeutic barriers exist when working with this population. And this is, I won't go too in depth with this part, but this is my epistemological stance, just in that there are multiple realities and they are all interpreted based on our own subjective lens. And that the acquisition of knowledge, we are constantly co-constructing what we believe about ourselves. The example I use is that if someone says that, if you say that you're funny, you only know you're funny if someone laughs at your jokes. So we really construct a sense of self by being in relationships with others. And so because of this epistemological stance, that's what led me to choose constructivist grounded theory as my methodological approach. So by using constructivist grounded theory, instead of using one form of data, I actually used 3. The intensive interviews, which were 40 to 60 minutes, and these are with the participants that I'll speak about in a minute. But then it was 14 open-ended questions and prompts, 36 sub-questions and sub-prompts, getting at those main areas that I identified. Those 4 areas that are in the sub-questions is what the interview questions were tailored to investigate. Then I also collected elicited documents. So this was a case study vetted by a focus group prior to the IRB application. And so this was really to gather what we have to do as clinicians as far as how we would document what our next steps would be, because whenever we document what next steps would be, even if it is for insurance or whatever purpose, it really shows what the intention behind the clinical goal is, but also what the thought processes are as far as why diagnoses are chosen. Really getting at that perception again. And then finally, extant documents. So I wanted to know not only How do we talk about it? How do we write about it and diagnose? But how are we trained from the very beginning? So I looked at 3 different training agendas, and I actually completed the trainings as well to get the experiential piece. So the participants that were part of this study were 11 participants throughout the US and in Portugal. And so these are clinicians who are trained in or certified specifically in perinatal mental health. And this was initially began in North America, but has expanded now to be international. With this certification, that means that someone has had at least 2 years of experience with the perinatal population and more than 20 hours of advanced training in perinatal mental health and a graduate degree in mental health. And with constructivist grounded theory, it's really this abductive reasoning, this iterative process that as you begin to collect data, you're also refining and seeing themes emerge. So there was initial coding, which was line by line, then focus coding, and then theoretical sampling. And so this is just a snapshot of the initial codes, an excerpt. There were many, many initial codes, and I intentionally used a technique of constructivist grounded theory, which was using gerunds. So instead of, for example, that first initial code, having the language, instead of saying uses words or, primary descriptions, it's keeping the action there because therapeutic processes are a process. In fact, it's important to keep that integrity of the code. So those codes, those initial codes were then refined into focus codes. So there are 24 focus codes that again kept the integrity of the codes with using gerunds, and finally ended up with 6 conceptual categories, which I will discuss. And then again, it's kind of showing the next phase of the process. Those 6 conceptual categories made up what I have, the model I developed called the phase model for reproductive loss, which the first phase is stabilization, the second, psychosomatic desensitization, and the third being reintegration. And here's the model. As you can see, you can visually see those 3 phases. My intention behind this model was so that you can come from any theoretical orientation, any cultural background, any sort of mental health training, or even eventually hoping to use this with the people who are in the medical field working with those clients during birth. But that first phase, the stabilization phase, being key for when fostering connection with clients. So that's attuning to clients, utilizing psychoeducation, holding space. As you can see, those 3 codes are used in all 3 phases, but they're used differently in all 3. So fostering connection in that space, utilizing education might look like normalizing those reactions and non-reactions, talking about the physical aspect of what they just experienced as well as the grief. And I would spend way more time on all of these if I had it, but just moving on to the second phase, what was interesting is that all 11 participants who are specialists in this field said that a psychosomatic approach to working with trauma is critical when working with these clients. So that was a huge bonus finding because it really emphasizes that it is such a physiological loss. And so before we can really assist clients in grieving, we have to decrease the trauma impacts enough to where they aren't triggered by discussing anything going on with grief. And so the psychosomatic approaches that were suggested were brain spotting and EMDR. And again, that was a totally unexpected finding. And as someone trained in brain spotting, it was a wonderful finding to see that all of these experts are saying the same thing. So the strengths of it, as you can see, it's the strengths and challenges are from the same different concepts, but you can look at it either way. So because it's intended to have structured flexibility, that's a strength in that it can be applied when even if you come from completely different theoretical foundations. However, because it's a conceptual model, newer practitioners would struggle using this because they need to be more grounded in practical techniques as well. The subjective use of it is a strength, but also, again, for newer clinicians can be a challenge. And then non-pathologizing, that is a strength because all of those reactions, we're talking about either ego-syntonic or ego-dystonic. They're healthy reactions to what has happened, but whenever there needs to be a diagnosis, again, for insurance purposes, et cetera, that can be difficult for some clinicians. So very quickly, I'll just kind of go over how these relate to the 4 sub-questions. So with that first one being, how do cultural perceptions influence their work? The 4 things that stood out was that the perceptions that did influence them were the ones held by the practitioner, both known and unknown biases, those held by the clients, which was an interesting find, the perceptions held by the client's support system, and then perceptions held by the client's culture. The second, how do they approach working with grief and trauma separately and concurrently? And it was, like I mentioned in the model, that trauma symptoms must be addressed first so that clients are not re-traumatized whenever grief models are applied without addressing trauma. And the third, what approaches inform clinical methods? All across the board, the participants said that it's the most important piece is the subjective experience of the client, and that we as practitioners are not in a place to say what is traumatic, what is not traumatic, what is impairment, what is not impairment. So it is really conceptualizing the client's experience. And then fourth, the barriers being inaccessibility to care, inadequate community resources, and the client's perception of wellness. So even if the client doesn't feel that they're deserving of feeling well. And then this is just literature to support these different areas, but running short on time. I think the implications are important because it shows that mental health practitioners pose a risk of reenacting cultural norming processes within the therapeutic process if they are not aware of what those cultural processes are, but also their own biases. So we must know the scope of our practice so we do not do any harm. And then education and training, just like a few presentations before, we need more emphasis on the reproductive years because we ignore the discussions of reproduction. We also ignore the discussions of reproductive loss. And there needs to be more research to create systemic change to then further change therapeutic processes. And then a main part in future research, I think it would be important to, from a societal perspective, even doing a mixed method study investigating the use of reproductive loss to establish a term. Currently, there's no term existing that describes someone who has experienced reproductive loss. We have widow, widower, orphan, but we don't have any term. So again, with that symbolic interactionism, if we don't have a word to speak about it, we can't talk about it. And then study from the relational perspective to discuss relational distress from loved ones. From a clinical perspective, having some sort of quantitative data to discuss like standardized assessments and how psychosomatic desensitization is impactful. And then, of course, from the client's perspective, investigating which rituals they have found most helpful after experiencing reproductive loss. That's it.